Welcome back to Season 2 of Defence Talk, Securing UK Advantage, a podcast brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with Trade Association, ADS Group and sponsored by BAE Systems. Here, we continue to explore the key questions shaping defence, technological and national security agendas in the UK. Through discussion with our expert guests, we aim to unpack the most topical themes, and today's episode will focus on how NATO and the UK are accelerating innovation to strengthen rearmament, deterrence and resilience across the alliance in our country, including through the use of dual technology. And we've got two exciting guests joining us to discuss this very, very hot topic, Paul.
Yes, we have. There's obviously a lot going on in the defence world around this right now. UK defence innovation is coming together. The new centralised hub for part of the innovation landscape. We've got the defence investment plan still being worked on, and almost every conference, almost every meeting is addressing these the issue that is critical arising from Ukraine, that in the next conflict, those who out-innovate the enemy will win. And everyone kind of understands that, but you can't do it until you're in the process. And we'll be hopefully exploring that with our two eminent guests.
Absolutely. And also, actually, earlier this month, Paul, in Bucharest, NATO Supreme Allied Command Transformation, together with NATO's Defence Industry Innovation and Armaments Division, co-organised a very important NATO Industry Forum where all these topics and more were discussed in detail. But without any further delay, we, of course, will cover this event as well with our guests. We would like to introduce our guests today.
Well, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Tanya Suárez, CEO and founder of IoT Tribe, an equity-free deep tech accelerator, and Brigadier retired John Ridge, who leads on adoption for the NATO Innovation Fund.
So welcome, John. Welcome, Tanya. Delighted to have you joining us today. And we would like to discuss with you innovation, acceleration and sustainment, all the buzzwords. So perhaps we can begin with a broader question. First of all, when we think about the innovation system or ecosystem, who are the key stakeholders and how would you define it?
That's a very good question, but it's actually, it does take a whole of system approach to bring innovation from the labs through to the market. So what does that mean? It means that it involves definitely universities and research centres of excellence. It involves, of course, the founders and proto-founders that are coming up with these magnificent solutions and prototypes that will ultimately land in defence. It involves investors. It involves supporting organisations such as ourselves, government, and so many other stakeholders, testing facilities, many different types of organisations form part of this wonderful ecosystem.
John.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Tanya said. The way I tend to think about it is in terms of sort of innovation suppliers, innovation customers, and then a whole series of organisations that enable the sort of transfer of the product from the supplier to the customer. And I think that there is complexity in all of those. So if we look on the supply side, as Tanya mentioned, that's everything from the universities where the ideas are starting all the way through the startup process to the point where this becomes a sort of going concern as a business. You then on the demand side, that's why it's really difficult for defence, because it's not like a normal sort of, if you were producing a commercial product, you get what product market fit as it's described, and that's it kind of done, because your customer can see it and buy it directly. Particularly with defence, it's very complicated because the person who's going to use it is probably not the person who's buying it. The problem who's buying it probably isn't the one that's got the money to buy it. And the one who's got the money to buy it isn't the one who organises these kind of portfolios. So you get this very complex stakeholder group on the customer side, which is one of the things that we have to navigate, both Tanya and I, in what we're doing through kind of the accelerator programme and through the NIF. And then all the enablers, which Tanya's talked about, whether it's venture, whether it's the testing evaluation facilities, there's a whole complexity around that as well.
Brilliant. So I referred earlier in my introduction, the recent event which took place in Bucharest in Romania. And I guess the key consequence or the key The key message from that event was that allies in industry should accelerate procurement through rapid adoption, increase production of cutting-edge technologies, and reinforce the transatlantic industrial base. Now, is this something new in comparison to the previous years, or is this a similar messaging as it was in earlier years?
Definitely the message has been for several years, we need to speed up the pace of procurement. And successive governments have tried, not just in the UK but elsewhere, different models. I mean, there's a just yesterday I think it was Pete Hesketh, excuse me, in the Department of War has completely reshaped how they're going to be procuring defence, simplifying it and giving greater autonomy to different units. But coming back to what we're seeing here in the UK, I think there's a concerted effort to also simplify where demand signals, what we call demand signals, are coming from. And there is something now called the National Armaments Directorate that is going to have not just greater say in terms of, for example, imports and exports, but also in how defence procurement is programmed. And that's an important thing. Previously, you would have very specific programs that would be directed at, for example, buying this phone or this cup. And now there's going to be something that is more cohesive, more cohered in terms of what's needed when and how the different components of the ecosystem kind of interact and interrelate. And there are two things perhaps that I think are worth signalling here. So first of all, Commercial X, which is going to be working on essentially a year and a half, 18-month commercial adoption mandate. And I think that we can also learn from Task Force Kindred that was specifically set up to procure for the Ukrainian context and war, and their procurement cycles were cut down to 2 weeks. So I think that, you know, that shows us that when we put our minds to things, we really can achieve them at great breakneck speed.
And John, from your point of view, how does NATO send demand signals? And what is it trying? What particular signal is it trying to send into the innovation universe?
So yeah, and I think building on what Tanya said earlier. So the Bucharest event was building on some previous stuff. So, and I would particularly point to NATO's Rapid Adoption Action Plan, which was released at the summit in the summer, which made a very, very clear undertaking by NATO to move much more quickly, hence the name rapid adoption. So there's a lot of work going on in NATO, and I think the Bucharest event was just another piece of that jigsaw kind of falling into place. But you're absolutely right. Another commitment that was made in the Rapid Adoption Action Plan was around demand signals specifically. And NATO has recognised that we need to move away from setting demand signals on industry in terms of requirements. Highly specified, very detailed requirements which explain exactly what they want from industry, often in very technical terms. What that does, though, is that constrains industry to delivering basically what they've been asked for rather than finding a better solution. So what we're seeing inside NATO is a move away from that highly specified requirements, and this is cascading down through the nations as well, into something that's much more around framing problems. And if you frame a problem and give that to startups in particular and say, look, here's the thing we want to be able to do, what do you think? Suddenly you can unlock all that imagination and that creativity that we've got in our startups. We mentioned universities earlier. That's how you attract interest, rather than saying, build me a box that's this big, weighs this much, has this number of wheels on it. Say, this is the problem we're trying to achieve. That's the shift which we're seeing inside NATO. And I'm involved with some of the work at the moment that's going on inside NATO of how you consolidate that off across a very large organization, and critically 32 nations, because they're all going to want to buy something. So how you pull that demand signal together into a way that you can then push out. And then critically for me, what that does then is that starts to level the playing field for startups. Because we're also, alongside this thing around speed, which I absolutely agree is critical, and Ukraine is telling us it could not be clearer, this speed of adaptation. We also need to think about a different business model, because the way you get faster is by not going through a process of governments funding research and development programs, and then that going into something aligned with a sort of cost plus approach to contracting. What's much faster is being open about problems as you're going through, allowing venture money to come in and for startups to start to produce prototypes and then exactly, and Tanya may want to comment on this, and then working alongside end users to refine those prototypes to get them to the quality that they need to be, and then delivering them at scale.
Tanya and John, you are both part of this innovation effort. In your day-to-day work, you contribute to it substantially. I would be very keen to understand more. What do your roles entail in practice? And what are the key problem sets that you are trying to address and to solve to help us to innovate, accelerate, and sustain our deterrence and preparedness? So perhaps, well, John, let's begin with you, and then Tanya.
Yeah, so and I think it's worth framing at the outset how Diana and the NIF fit together. So I always think of sort of like cousins. So Diana sits inside NATO, and Tanya can talk about the role in there, but much more focused on the sort of early stage. The NIF, the NATO Innovation Fund, was set up outside NATO because it's a venture capital fund, and there was a decision taken that would give us the freedom to invest into the right areas. So we're established. 24 of the 32 nations have committed their capital to the fund. We've got €1 billion to invest over 15 years. We're 2 years into that process. And the idea of that is to provide patient capital into deep tech startups that contribute to defense, security, and resilience. So a very, very broad spectrum, and I can come back to later, the sorts of companies we're invested in. But we then make a series of investments. About 4/5 of what we do goes into direct investments. So we take equity in startups in return for our capital and help them grow. And then about 20%, a fifth, then goes into indirect investments. So we will invest in other venture capital funds, particularly in parts of Europe, because it's European LPs that are in the fund, parts of Europe that haven't got a particularly vibrant VC ecosystem. We will invest in funds to start that. So that's the overall model of how the NIF functions. So it is a classic VC mechanism to enable startups through giving them capital. My role inside that, so I'm not involved on the investment side directly, but what I am involved with is a thing called, I run the Mission Platform Group. And the Mission Platform Group supports our portfolio companies on 3 areas. I'll come back to adoption because that's where the vast majority of our effort goes. The first area we work on is protect. So we are investing in startups who we think are bright cutting edge. So we want to help them avoid adversaries being able to get hold of that. So whether it's cyber protection or helping them understand how to keep their cap tables clean so that you haven't got adversary capital on their cap tables. That's one example on protect. Secondly, sustainability and responsible use. So where we want to help our companies build responsible technology. So you'll have seen the stuff that's happening in Ukraine around arming of uncrewed systems. We help our companies do things like that in a way that aligns with NATO's principles of responsible use. And then the final bit, which is where, as I say, the majority of our effort goes, is on adoption. So it's great having these startups, and it's great having great technology, but if it doesn't end up in the hands of end users in a sustainable way across the alliance, then you've made no difference to NATO's capability. So we focus that on adoption of getting that technology and basically landing contracts. How do you get a proper contract? Not a research and development, not a prototyping, but a proper contract so that this capability is then available to NATO.
Thank you so much, John. And Tanya, I recall I attended one of the events organized by your organization earlier this year, where some of the startup representatives presented their ideas to potential investors and also to other fellow startup colleagues. Could you please tell us a bit more what your work entails and how does it help the innovation effort in this country and across the alliance?
Absolutely. So the first thing, you need to prove that their particular part of the technology can be integrated, it's interoperable. It says what it does in the tin. So there we bring in other types of validation organisations, for example, the catapults, that can help with those testing and validation activities, which are important to de-risk the technology, not just from a technological perspective, but also for investors, right? So an investor, if they want to come in and invest in a dual-use startup, they want to make sure that it does do what it says it does, it can do, but also, and I'll come back to John's point now, that there is a market for that technology, and that de-risking what they do commercially is also a key part of what we're doing. Now, to do that, we need to make sure that we're constantly bringing in many organisations that have the capability to do the bits that we can't do, whether that's on the technology side, whether that's on the fundraising side, and many other pieces. But we don't just work with Diana, NATO with those cohorts. We also work with the UKDI DASA cohorts, so a broader selection of companies, startup scale-ups that are part of the UK's industrial base, and I think that's what's really exciting.
Tanya, for understandable reasons, a lot of people involved in early stage defence research don't want to talk about what they do, but some do. And it would be great to hear what's the most exciting thing you've come across as almost a pointer and an inspiration to other people to get into this space.
Well, to be honest, there are so many different companies that have come through our programme that are really exciting and groundbreaking. And I think to your point, there's a real change in how people and innovators look at defence as a sector. There's a lot more passion for actually contributing to our shared resilience and upholding our values and be able to defend what we really truly believe in. So I think that would be my first thing. And secondly, to give you some more precise examples, perhaps, so around energy resilience and environmental security. This is a topic that is dear to many people's heart. We've had a company come through, I think it wasn't through our acceleration programme, it's through a previous Diana programme, UK company called Pure Alchemy, and what they do is closed loop combustion to essentially make sure that energy is available in the field. So really, really exciting company. We have another one that did come through our first UK sensing and surveilling cohort called RV Magnetics. What they do is essentially guarantee the structural integrity of everything from large infrastructure through to much smaller devices. What does structural integrity mean? It means that if you have a helmet, you've had an accident, you're making sure that helmet continues to be safe for you to use. If you look at large infrastructure, it can be for a plane to make sure that plane is safe and can fly safely. So lots of different use cases for that, and that's just two.
I suppose one obvious problem is the scale of defence. I often hear VCs in the general tech space saying, there can never be a Meta, there can never be an open AI in defence. Therefore, our interest in investing in and scaling defence early stage companies is always going to be limited. How do we overcome that sort of quite valid objection?
Well, firstly, I don't think that's necessarily quite true. I mean, we've got very big multi-billion euro, dollar, pound companies, Helsing, Palantir, exactly. So I think that this can be a very, very big market for many companies. I think that the challenge for us is to make sure that it isn't a locked or closed market. So from a government perspective, that we don't have vendor lock-in, that we're obligated always to buy from the same supplier because they hold every single card to deliver what we need, and that is a challenge. So it's less about this not being a big enough market and more about making sure that this is a big enough market that is open, where there can be competition, where we're always sourcing from the best.
And of course, venture capitalists, PE, private equity, hedge funds all have different models, but they all eventually want to get out. They all, unless they want
to exit.
Yes, they want their money plus X times X. Is there? Where are we on addressing the problem of the exit? Because pension funds are still quite reputationally sort of turned off by defence, even dual use. What are you seeing in terms of developments in the culture of the wider financial ecosystem that could encourage a young entrepreneur in the idea that if they make the product, if it works on the battlefield, somebody in the end is going to help them scale it to the size that it deserves to be?
there's a whole lot to unpack there. So the first thing is I'm totally with Tanya. Anduril, the example in the US, very, very big company.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've got Helsing in Europe. We have TechEver in our portfolio. They're already a unicorn, Portuguese company. Stark coming through on the rails as well. I think there are an increasing number. Personal view, slightly surprising the UK hasn't got one.
Yep.
Be my kind of observation as someone who now obviously thinks Europe rather than UK. There's definitely a missing piece there, I think. And Tanya touched on fragmentation. One of the challenges in Europe is that if you have all the European nations buying only from their own suppliers, it's going to be very difficult to build something which will compete, particularly with the kind of Andurils and the Palantirs and everything else. What's interesting is we are seeing that change though, and I'm seeing, for example, TechEver building a lot of factories in the UK. They've built one in Wales already. They're building another one outside Swindon. We're seeing the same with Stark. We're seeing the same with Arx Robotics, another one of our companies. So I think that will be the increasing model, is the IP might be owned in country A, but the factories, the jobs, the supply chain value can be in countries B, C, D, and E. So there's definitely a model there, which I think is really interesting. Specifically on exits, I think this is a fascinating area. And at the moment, there are a number of routes. So our portfolio companies, some of them will potentially get acquired by existing defense primes, whether they're the traditional primes or whether they're the neo primes. I hope that we'd start to see the multiples increase on that, because some of the multiples that we've seen for acquisitions in the past are quite low, if I'm being honest. I think as this becomes a better market to be in, they should go up. So that's one route. There's also a sort of private equity route. Again, I think there's a lot happening in that area. I'm not over all of it by any means, but I think where you're seeing the potential to roll up a number of companies to produce a new type of prime, you could see a model happening there. So I think there's a load of stuff happening here. And I also hope genuinely that as many companies as possible are able to IPO and then end up being publicly traded. Not many happened so far, but Palantir, if you look at that and how that's traded recently, that's been a lesson in how good it can be. So there's a ton of stuff in there, but it's not yet played out fully, I wouldn't say, and we've got a way to go to work out exactly what the next 5-10 years look like.
When we think about the alliance, NATO as a whole, we recently actually had a discussion on collective defense and NATO capability gaps. I guess I would be interested in understanding more when it comes to NATO innovation space as a whole. How coherent is the alliance, and how do we reconcile different interests of different regions and different countries which are part of the alliance? What are the practical examples that you've encountered, and how can we make it more efficient?
So there is something called the Common Operating Picture, and another called the Common Intelligence Picture, so COP and KIP. And I think that those are essentially frameworks or environments in which everyone contributes, because it is to everyone's advantage that we have operational capability that is shared, and we are obviously much stronger together than any one of us is apart. And the same goes for intelligence. You know, if you're gathering intelligence from multiple sources and that intelligence can be refined in a way that it gives you an operational advantage, well, what's not to like?
Yeah, and again, I think it's worth being clear about the role of NATO versus the role of nations. So NATO sets the overall requirement, what the whole problem looks like, and then effectively divides that problem up and says, here nations, here's how you play a substantive part in that. And particularly, I would say, let's focus on deterrence, because that's basically what NATO is there to do. It's to set out a series of plans which will deter our adversaries. So that sets out the overall kind of shape of things. The vast majority of kit that's procured for NATO is procured by nations. There is a relatively small amount that's common funded, and Tanya's touched on a couple of things there, particularly around sort of software and things like that, where you want that done as a NATO level to provide a kind of standard across the whole of the alliance. But as I say, the vast majority of the kit is actually procured by nations. I think what's really promising is we're now seeing, two organisations that I think are worth mentioning. First, Allied Command Transformation. So seeing the way they're starting to set out operational challenges. So we saw it recently on a thing called Task Force X-Baltic. They set out a large challenge and said to the nations, turn up with kit and we'll integrate it into a NATO provided platform and we'll see what we can do in underwater uncrewed systems, in air UAVs and uncrewed surface vehicles. So we saw the nations come together, demonstrate and experiment around how that would fit together. And there'll be a series of those ACT-led exercises. And we're seeing exactly the same for Allied Command operations. So we've been working very closely with Land Command on a couple of exercises. There's one already being run called the Eastern Flank Deterrence Line. Again, they've invited industry in to say, hey, this is the broad sort of operational idea. What do you think you can contribute to it? And what that does is that allows the companies to bring their kit along to experiment and see how it works. But critically, it also allows the warfighters to then see what's available.
Do you feel that the industry is now being more engaged and is becoming a more active player in this field?
If I may, John, I would say absolutely. So I was delighted to be invited to an industry day at the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps facilities here in the UK. And the room was full of industry. Obviously, many of them already serving defence, so very much part of the defence establishment, if you like. But many other sizes and shapes and types of companies that were really interested in seeing what they could do, how could they fit into this very complex ecosystem that needs to deliver technology to serve operational needs.
Can I throw a sort of niche, but I think vital issue onto the table, which is in these discussions about innovation in general and specifically in defence, we often hear about the inventor, the scientist who's creating maybe a capability or a material. Then we often hear about them being helped to commercialize it, and then all those problems that you've described. But there is a middle bit, which is the manufacturing process. Well, even software has to be manufactured, but above all, hardware does. And just in general, in some of the research I've done in UK SME sector, the sector is crying out for innovation in manufacturing itself. How much of that do you run into? Because if you're a young scientist in a pure science, you're likely thinking about, okay, these guys want, for better or worse, new ways of deterring, new ways of creating effect on the battlefield. To my mind, I don't meet enough people who are thinking, I need a way to transform the UK shipbuilding industry.
I could not agree more. And interestingly, when I get asked from my perspective, and I obviously focus particularly on the defence side rather than security and resilience, but they say, what are the areas that you think are going to be interesting? One is around uncrewed systems. That's a trend which is absolutely, I think that's an unstoppable trend, frankly. And the second is exactly what you described, which is manufacturing base and supply chains. So if you look at what's happened in Ukraine, where we've moved from using traditional, quite complex defence systems, which have very, very complex supply chains and very, very lengthy manufacturing processes. That has pivoted towards things which can be generated at scale very quickly and iterated very, very quickly. And we've ended up with a really different looking manufacturing base. Lots of distributed manufacturing, because you put it all in one factory and it gets hit by the Russians, you lose all that stuff. So distributed. You're also seeing things like novel materials coming in. You're seeing usually trying to harness existing commercial supply chains rather than having exquisite defense specific ones, because again, that gives you scale. And I think this is one of the reasons, this is the bit around dual use that's sometimes missed. Dual use is partly around trying to smooth out demand signals and have multiple markets. But from a defense perspective, dual use is great because you can harness a supply chain which is used to providing millions of cars, for example, and you can take elements of that and apply that to your military and your defense systems. And if we're being blunt about it, the thing that's going to deter Russia is less what you can field on day one than what it thinks you can do 6 months or a year into a conflict. That's the lesson of every large conflict we've ever been in. And I am totally with you. So I'd be fascinated if you're seeing great startups that are doing interesting things with materials or manufacturing techniques, please send them my way.
So, John, building on your point, you've just mentioned how do we deter our adversaries? I guess the key question to answer is also how do we successfully build that continuous innovation cycle at a wartime pace? So what's the recipe?
So I think, so coming back to some of the things that John highlighted there, I think that if we're looking at our current situation, there is something around the economics of war, right? So how much does it cost? And we just saw this recently with the response of NATO when Russia sent some very cheap, by the way, drones, which I think are around 40,000 euros, the cost of the drones they sent over into Poland. And our NATO response, the cost of responding to that, I forget the exact figures, but it was probably around the order of, I think I remember it was around 8 million, right? So if you look at the economics of war there, like 40,000 cost of just sending a few drones, 8 million allied response, there's something there that we need to really consider from the start. And John touched on a couple of things there. First of all, we need to have an industrial base that is capable of delivering and manufacturing off-the-shelf components, right? So what essentially the COTS kind of components. We can't always be relying on the state-of-the-art, the absolute exquisite sensor that is super expensive, or the semiconductor that is super expensive to manufacture, because that's not going to be what wins us this particular war. No. It might act as a deterrent in our next war, but we are always going to have to be, calibrating what do we need now for what versus what we need for the future. The second point, I think, which is also something that John touched on, is the distribution. So we need to be resilient, not just in one place, but across multiple points of manufacture. So ensuring that we have capability everywhere from Estonia to Portugal to Swindon is going to be in our long-term interest, but also in our short-term interest, because we need to be able to produce constantly to meet the demands that we have today.
And we can absolutely do this. So this is what I often find very frustrating, is I look back at my time in uniform when, for example, in Afghanistan, the counter-ID campaign, we demonstrated that we could iterate incredibly quickly. We'd see a threat, we'd be able to field a countermeasure in weeks, months at the most. So we can absolutely do this. I think one of the challenges is that we all need to rethink what we mean by what's often described as core capabilities. So the things on which you sort of rely. I'm concerned that a core capability can no longer be a load of tanks that are sat in storage ready to pull out, or a load of ships, or a load of aircraft, because the one thing that Ukraine has shown us is just how quickly they become obsolete. So we need to rethink, rather than, and this is kind of like moving from a CapEx to an OpEx thinking. So instead of investing a lot of capital in things which are basically sat there just in case, we need to think about more of our capability as a sort of operational expenditure, where you need enough to train with, and that keeps the sort of industrial supply chains moving. And then if you end up in a conflict, you then want to be able to really scale that production up very, very quickly, and continue to be able to iterate those capabilities as you're fighting and as the adversary is countering what you can do. That's a very different model from what we're used to. It makes financial planning much more difficult, because if you're used to a system at the moment where you plot out over the next, and it'll be fascinating to see what the DIP says, but if you plot out what you're going to spend over the next 10 years in exact detail, I'm afraid you're going to end up with a load of obsolete capabilities.
Who's solving that problem best?
It's very interesting, and the Department of War memo was mentioned earlier. I think the US has generally tended to move most quickly. I'm very interested in what I'm seeing out of Germany in terms of both a very rapid increase in defence budget, and I think because to a certain extent they're coming from a relatively low base, it looks like quite a lot of that money can go towards disruptive new capabilities. Yep. I'll be honest, I've not yet seen that from the UK. I suspect there's quite a lot of money going into traditional programs, and I'd really love more of that to go into disruptive startup-driven capabilities.
I think I'll come back to the, off the shelf. I mean, we're talking about dual use in many cases. So that drones, of course, they have military uses, they have non-military uses, and you can apply that to many, many other types of technology. So let's make sure that we do have that ability to fund all stages of that pipeline, but also critically, I think again John mentioned this earlier on, it's not just about giving grants, it's also making sure that there are demand signals in the form of specific contracts that are awarded, and those will act as magnets or signals in turn to investors that yes, this company has something that the market wants. So I think that's pretty critical.
And just very quickly building on that as well, I think the other bit we need to think about is how we do competitions. To me, that's one of the most important things. If you run a competition by essay writing, where you basically say, hey, write us your best essay on what your thing is going to be able to do, I'm afraid you won't get the right answer. If instead you run a competition that says, turn up in 6 months' time with your thing, your prototype, and we'll fly it off or drive it off or sail it off against the competitors, and from that we will down select to a contract, and you run a proper competition with proper capabilities. That's how A, you build speed into the acquisition process, and B, you level the playing field. Because at the moment the startups find it very difficult to compete where you've got big teams that can write massive tender documents that are able to lobby at the top of government. And this is the same across all of NATO. This isn't just a kind of UK thing. If you level the playing field, you give them the opportunity to compete properly.
But what role do traditional defence primes play when it comes to innovation, acceleration and sustainment?
They're an absolutely critical part of the system. And I think there's a danger that the debate becomes a bit binary. It's sort of either traditional primes or startups, and it's absolutely not. So we work really closely with the traditional defence, so sort of traditional primes and the whatever you want to call them, neo primes as well. The area where I think it's really, so what are the primes good at? They are really good at integration. They're really good at putting together lots of complex components into a platform. So that's one thing where they definitely work. And the other one they're really good is at scale manufacturing. So I absolutely foresee a future where we've got startups moving very quickly and prototyping, generating prototypes, and then able to hand that prototype across to a large defence industrial partner who's able to scale the production rather than the startup having to scale production themselves. And we're already starting to see that with some of the discussions that our startups are having, our portfolio companies are having with defence partners. So it is absolutely, it is definitely not the end of the defence prime. That said, I think there will be some defence primes who are found wanting in terms of their ability to respond at the speed, or frankly, to be comfortable working with startups. So I think it's sort of slightly the onus is on them to explain how they fit into what I think is a slightly different model.
And I think you also touched on this, John, we do need to move away from cost plus modelling. We need to be able to, and I think that one of the things that the Department of War announced a couple of days ago was this idea that you need to reward when an organisation has invested heavily in R&D, that needs to come across also in their pricing. So it's that there is a rethink there needed in terms of, again, the economics of what we're doing and the outcomes that we're looking for. There are all sorts of obstacles for inter-ally kind of procurement, and I think that is something that we need to fix. Some countries have a mechanism that's called an offset agreement.
Yep.
So I think that's quite interesting because that says, okay, well, yes, we're going to be purchasing for you, but that means that you have to provide some evidence of an equivalent investment in our national, in our nation, right? So that can be building a factory, it can be sourcing components or supplies, it can be employing people, it can be setting up a lab with a university. So I think that's a really interesting mechanism to encourage that, looking beyond your borders and really kind of procuring from the best that our allied markets have to offer.
And of course, the UK Defence Industrial Strategy does commit to an offsetting scheme, but they haven't designed it yet. I think they're consulting on it now. I wanted to ask John, maybe both of you, about a cultural problem in this space, which is to be a startup in Silicon Valley, you may need some, as they say, white shoe money. You may need old money, but you don't need to communicate with old people. But the defence space is full of people who have served in the traditional three-domain analog battlefield, and they are now the most senior decision makers. And of course, they see at the other end of the career structure very young, very exciting innovators. What is your experience of how these two parts of how the plug and the socket fit together? How do we help overcome the cultural problems of simple lack of understanding by the most senior people?
Yeah, and I would definitely de-link culture and demographics. Gwyn Jenkins and Rich Knighton, for example, two really good examples of genuinely forward-thinking, innovative individuals. So and exactly the same in the other services as well. So I don't think it's around how long someone's been in. There is a challenge of risk aversion, and I remember as the innovation director when I was trying to work out why the wrong decisions whether the right decisions were not being made or the wrong decisions were being made, and the two are slightly different. Often you have to come down to individual human beings and look at their motivations and their incentives, where they're sat that day. And the incentives are not yet set up right inside many of our systems for people to take sensible risks. And I'll bring that to life with a really specific example. So Tanya mentioned Commercial X. One of the reasons Commercial X works very well is because you tend to embed your Commercial X people inside the project team that's delivering the project. That then immerses them in what the project's trying to achieve. So instead of worrying about, I'm sat in a commercial organization reporting through a pure commercial chain all the way up through defense, I'm actually sat inside a project team. So when someone says, can I take a bit of commercial risk here? They understand the context of it and they can see the immediate benefit in terms of accelerating the project delivery. That's very different from if you're on speed dial, sat in a completely different building, you have no idea of the context, and all your incentives are basically about zeroing commercial risk. So I worry when people talk about culture. Feels like a kind of a way of dodging the reality, which is actually about individual motivations.
I think on the point of risk aversion, so just thinking back on my experience pre-defence, what happens in a large corporate is that you got large by essentially doing whatever it is that you do in a way that is repeatable, scalable. You have processes that relate to compliance. You have processes that direct every stage of, if you're in a manufacturing process, every stage of that process. And it's very much a kind of like rinse and repeat model that keeps costs down, but reliability high. And I think defence is very similar to that. So, you know, if there is risk aversion, it's because we've required the system to provide us with something that is super reliable, which is great. But that reliability does come at the cost of innovation and taking risks. But I think, Paul, to your earlier point, I would agree or concur with John that I haven't found this to be the risk aversion to be correlated with demographics. It is maybe perhaps to do more with the role that they've played and the contact that they've had with innovators across the innovation ecosystem or across their careers. So one of the things that we want to do within Janus Allies and alongside UKDI and DASA is to provide those touch points in which regardless of where they are in the military, they can come in and they can actually interact with these technology providers, and they can understand the art of the possible.
I think, Paul, to your very provocative question, and thank you so much for your answers, dear guests, we actually will be hosting a very, very, very interesting and senior guest for one of our upcoming episodes who has very actively embraced innovation, and I'm sure we'll be able to ask some of these questions as well during that recording. But I'm afraid today our time has run out, but I would like to sincerely thank you, John and Tanya, for joining us for this very timely, very important conversation, which I'm sure will not go away anytime soon, and we hope that we will be able to continue this discussion with you and your colleagues. And on behalf of Paul and myself, I of course would like to thank all of our listeners again for joining in and listening to this News Defence Talks episode, and we are very much looking forward to reconnecting with you again in the upcoming weeks. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.